For over a half-century, television audiences have embraced the sparkling personality of Betty White.
And when I think of Betty White, I always see her with a big, open smile.
She was ahead of her time, as a woman determined to have her own career.
I knew that I wasn't going to be content to just stay home, and I knew that a career was very much in my future, so I decided not to have children.
Since the early days of television, she has been a constant friend in an ever-changing medium.
They said, "Do you think you can do a half hour every day, 5 days a week?" I thought, a half hour? What do we do with the rest of the time? I've been doing 5.5 hours, 6 days a week. I'll try.
Betty White's been in television for as long as she can remember or anybody else can remember.
Betty has devoted her life to the care and well-being of animals, making a difference in how millions of people care for their four-legged friends. She had finally found her true love late in life.
Well, he bought this beautiful wedding ring, and he said, "You might as well, you're going to wear it one day."
But a dreadful disease ended her 18-year love affair.
And I said to her, "Betty, what went wrong?" Because we had both led these charmed lives up until then.
Her unbridled commitment to life, laughter, and love has made Betty a welcomed friend to generations of fans and animals alike. I'm Alex Trebek, and this is an intimate portrait of my friend, Golden Girl Betty White. Betty White's passions for show business and the well-being of animals have made her a tremendous force in both kingdoms.
For me, talk about combining your loves, to be able to be in show business and still be able to seriously work with and for the zoo. And it's the best of all worlds.
Betty's love of animals reaches worldwide, but her greatest love is right at home.
Panda was a cruelty case down at the SPCA LA. I was down there for a meeting one day, and all of a sudden here's this gorgeous little creature. She was only 6 months old, or less than 6 months at that time. And she couldn't be adopted out. She was impounded as evidence in the trial. And single-handedly, she closed this pet shop that had been selling these sick animals and these abused animals.
Betty can't claim to be the first animal lover in her family. Her parents, Horace and Tess White, exposed her to the magnificence of the animal world from the day she was born on January 17, 1922, on the outskirts of Chicago.
Betty came to Los Angeles when she was 2 years old, went through schools here, and has been an integral part of our community for years.
Even though she was an only child, Betty was never lonely. She always had companions around the house, those of the four-legged kind.
Some of us are born with a very, very great love and interest for animals. I call it a birth affect. I think some of us have it, some of us can acquire it, but I have a feeling that Betty was born with it.
I was the luckiest little kid in the world, because, I mean, if I said, you know, that I loved animals, I mean, every once in a while they'd come home with one, "Well, he followed me home. Can we keep him, Betty?"
Betty's love of nature began early on when the Whites decided to show their girl the wonders of California's mountains.
We'd pack into the high Sierras, and we'd stay in there for like 3 weeks at a time. They'd take us in by pack train, and we'd ride in, and then the camping equipment would be on the mule pack. And then they'd leave us there and come back and get us three weeks later. And I used to live all year. Christmas was nice, and all those other things were nice, but I used to live all year for those high Sierra trips.
During the Depression, money was tight for the Whites, but Betty's dad made sure that they gave homes to many of their neighborhood's unwanted pets.
We didn't have any money, so as extra work, Dad would make radios and to sell and make some extra money. Well, nobody else had any money either. So he would trade them for dogs. Well, the radios didn't eat, but the dogs did. And it wasn't the best business deal he ever made.
Growing up next door to the big Hollywood studios never influenced Betty's dreams as a child. She found her calling all on her own.
I was never that conscious of the Hollywood stuff. I was always going to be a writer. I wrote the graduation play from grammar school at Horace Mann Grammar School in Beverly Hills. And of course, as any red-blooded American girl would do, I wrote myself into the lead, and the showbiz bug bit me.
Her show business debut was anything but glamorous.
I wrote this Japanese play, The Land of the Rising Sun, which I thought was a dynamite title. And it was done in the old Japanese theater where the princess, of course, would come out and she'd wheeze away and she'd talk to the nightingale in the cage. Well, one of the football players in a black suit would come out and hold the cage, as they do in the Japanese theater. They'd bring the props out and hold them.
Betty continued her pursuit of acting all through school and added singing to her repertoire.
I was studying very seriously to be an opera singer at that point, and I would have been an opera singer. The only little silly part was I didn't have quite the voice for it, but otherwise than that, I was there. But I sang at graduation, and I didn't sing an aria or anything. I found a song for graduation, Spirit Flower. It starts, my heart was frozen. It's this woman standing beside the grave while her heart freezes because her lover is in the... Why I sang it at graduation and why they let me sing it at graduation.
That performance in 1939, however, attracted the attention of some people who were experimenting with a new invention, television.
The student body president, Harry Bennett, and I were invited to do an experimental television thing. So on the 6th floor, they were doing a production and experimenting with television cameras. And they did a segment of The Merry Widow. And I wore my graduation dress, and I did the waltz, and I sang the song, and it was wonderful. We had brown lipstick and dark, dark makeup, and the lights were so hot that the perspiration, the brown makeup ran. On the 1st floor was an auto showcase where they sold Packard motor cars. And the audience, if they stood around there, they had monitors that could pick up the show that was on the 6th floor. Wasn't that amazing? It went all the way down to maybe gravity took it down to the 1st floor. It was all brand new, and it was science fiction to us at that point.
Unfortunately, in 1940, Betty White and the rest of the world's citizens were forced to put their plans on hold for the next few years.
A little thing called World War II came along. And at that point, you forgot all about show business. You forgot about everything except doing what you could. So I joined the AWVS, American Women's Voluntary Services. And we'd go to the coffees at night where you danced with the guys, but then during the day, my mom and I would go out with the rest of the gals and do alterations and sewing.
Near the end of World War II, Betty met a soldier named Dick Barker. She fell in love.
Within weeks of VE Day had happened, and I married a P-38 pilot. And then VJ came. He told me after we were married that he had been mustered out. So we drove back to Bell Center, Ohio, there were 830 people in Bell Center. And it was a real adjustment. We finally moved back out here, but that one didn't last. And then you feel that's a failure. After Dick Barker and I broke up, I went to a little theater in Beverly Hills, the Bliss Hayden Little Theater, and was doing some shows there. The first one I did, you had to pay a tuition. It was like a school, and I paid $50 to do the first show. And then we finished that, and they did the next one, and they called me into the office, and I didn't have to pay the $50. It was like getting a raise. You know, I could do the next show for free.
At one performance, a young veteran-turned-talent agent took notice of her.
And there was this very nice young agent in town, Lane Allen, and he came to see the show, and asked me out afterwards, after a couple of times, and he was a delightful man. He was a lovely man, and we fell very much in love.
In 1949, Betty and Lane decided to marry. Everything was looking up for Betty, a new husband and a new job. Betty found work as a sidekick to popular Los Angeles disc jockey Al Jarvis on his new show, Hollywood on Television. But Betty's husband Lane wanted to have a family and was not happy that she wanted a career.
I knew that I wasn't going to be content to just stay home, and I knew that a career was very much in my future, and he wanted me to, there was a little jealousy. So finally I said no, and he wanted to have a family, naturally. If I did have a baby, that baby would have to be the whole thing for me. And I wasn't, that's not my field of expertise, so I decided not to have children. And in those days, people didn't understand that as readily as they do now.
Betty and Lane decided to separate after less than a year of marriage, and eventually they divorced, ending Betty's second marriage.
Boy, you feel like you've really flunked the course. I mean, it's a terrible, self-defeating thing. I failed. It's your failure. It's not anybody else's. And with Lane, it was. It was my failure to live up to the kind of a wife he wanted to have.
28 years old and dejected, Betty moved back home once again with her parents.
I was the boomerang kid. I'd get married and then I'd move back home. Then I'd get married the second time and I moved back home. I was ashamed to tell anybody that I still lived at home because by that time the years had gone by.
Betty moved on from her failed relationships by throwing herself into her work. Betty's local fans loved her, and soon all of America would feel the same way. The 1950s would be a watershed decade for Betty. Everything in her life was changing rapidly, but one thing stayed the same: her endless devotion to her furry friends. And even today, Betty loves to share about her adopted family.
Kita was puppy raised up in Alaska, my golden, as a guide dog. He was in his training, his puppy socializing period. And his hips didn't quite measure up to go into his serious training. So I waited 8 months for him, but I got him. And he's my heart.
Her eyes always just light up when she talks about the animals. She, and especially if she talks about her own animals.
1950. After 2 brief marriages, Betty decided to focus on her career in show business. She was working long hours on a hit Los Angeles TV show called Hollywood on Television. The number of people owning television sets was rapidly expanding, along with Betty's popularity.
We were on 33 hours a week with 5.5 hours a day, 6 days a week, and that wasn't quite enough for Al Jarvis or for me. We did an hour variety show at night. And we would do sketches, and I'd do songs, and we'd do a sketch to lead into the song, and my song would pay off the joke in the sketch.
Betty became so popular that she was approached with the idea of starring in her own television series.
One of the sketches was always a husband and wife thing, Alvin and Elizabeth. And so one day the station manager, Don Feddersen, called us in and said, "Could you do that as a half-hour show?"
Life with Elizabeth was a hit with Los Angeles viewers and soon began to air on stations across America. Betty was not only the star of the show, but became one of the first female television producers.
In those days, it was kind of cool, and a woman didn't usually have a production company, or that was kind of unusual.
Betty White in Life with Elizabeth.
Come on, the game isn't over yet, will you, sir?
Now, don't get nervous. This is my spinner with the English twist.
Are you going to stand there and talk, or are you going to...
There we go. 21 to nothing.
Oh, no. That wasn't fair. Off guard.
All is fair in love and ping pong.
I think we're still running in Australia. I think the Maoris and the kangaroos love us.
The The next year, Betty won her first Emmy Award for Best Actress in Life with Elizabeth, and also became the host of Hollywood on Television. The NBC television network took notice of Betty and offered her her own daytime variety show.
That was such a big victory to go network with a daytime show. I had done the Rose Parade network, but never a series of my own, so we did, oddly enough, the Betty White show. We had the meetings about what we would do. They said, do you think you can do a half hour every day, 5 days a week? I thought, a half hour, what do we do with the rest of the time? I've been doing 5.5 hours, 6 days a week. I said, I'll try.
Betty White's been in television for as long as she can remember or anybody else can remember. She very often says, I was famous in silent television. She worked in silent television.
Betty White has logged more hours on television, I think, than any other human being ever.
To do the NBC show, though, Betty had to end Hollywood on Television. But her two new shows kept her quite busy.
Life with Elizabeth we did for a while at the same time, so I'd finish the half-hour daytime and then we'd rehearse and then shoot the show live in front of a live audience, the Life with Elizabeth at night.
Can you take criticism?
Naturally.
I think you pinged when you should have ponged.
1954 brought the cancellation of Life with Elizabeth after 2 years, and her NBC daytime variety show after only 1. Game shows were beginning to be very popular, and Betty made her rounds as a panelist on many of them. She became very fond of one show in particular, Password, with host Alan Ludden. From first glance, Alan was enamored with Betty. Alan asked Betty to go out with him and his best friends, Grant Tinker and Mary Tyler Moore. He put his friends to work on this double date.
Grant and I were auditioning her on behalf of Alan Ludden. Alan said, I want you to meet her, and I really hope you like her, because I really like her. And we were as charming and polite as we could possibly be, but we were making mental notes. Observed holding Alan's hand, that's good. Observed laughing a little too hard at his joke. Perhaps she's heard it before and didn't cover up as well as she might have. I mean, it was just crazy things that we do to each other. But we loved her immediately. How could you not?
He was smitten very quickly. And they had a lot, and I don't know if they had a lot in common. Alan was kind of a straight-laced guy, and Betty is Betty. I mean, she can play anything from a nun to a trollop, and does. And he was just thrilled by, her outspoken humor, etc. And they fell in love. He really did fall very quickly. I'm not sure Betty came around quite that quickly.
In 1962, Alan proposed marriage to Betty, but still fearful from her 2 failed marriages, she flatly refused his offer.
That was one thing we just couldn't quite accept, how she could turn this dear man down, and handsome and bright and smart and all those things.
He was such a romantic. Well, he bought this beautiful wedding ring, and he said, you might as well, you're going to wear it one day. I said, and I got mad, as, in my sweet nature. I got real mad. He put it on a chain around his neck, so whenever we were at the beach or whenever, there was the ring around his neck.
After a year of trying, Alan finally prevailed on Betty to be his bride.
Alan and I had been cast together to do a summer stock show up in Cape Cod and on up into Maine. Of course, you could fall in love with your grandmother up in that country, it's so beautiful, but fall in love we did. I got married to Alan Ludden in 1963 after a year's courtship, a year of me being silly enough to keep saying no.
Betty not only became Alan's wife, but also stepmother to his 3 teenage children.
It took a lot of adjusting on all sides. Their mother was dead. She had died, and so he'd tell the kids, no, you can't do something. They'd come, well, then they'd come to me, and I heard no from him. Well, no in my house, it always meant, they didn't use the word unless it was, when they said no, the argument was over. So I'd say, no, your dad said absolutely not. Well, then they'd go back to him and he'd say, well, okay, if you want to do that. That's a tough thing to live with. It took a little adjusting in that department.
Betty quickly adapted as a member of the Ludden family, but one thing was still missing for her: the pattering of paws in her home. So she brought 2 poodle puppies into the family.
I think what got Alan was when we'd come home at night, the kids often would be, you know, doing their own thing, other places. But the dogs were always, I don't care if you'd been to Tibet or to the mailbox, you got the same greeting when you came in, and they were always there, glad to see you. You'd have to hunt the kids down sometimes, but the animals were always there. I think that got to Alan. Interviewers would ask him, were you always such an animal lover? He said, I didn't know it till I met Betty.
Alan and Betty were about to combine their passions for animals and show business and create their first television show together. But what they didn't know is that it would be their last. Betty's devotion to the animals she has adopted over the years has made them much more than pets to her. They've become her family.
I can't shortchange. I mean, you've met 2 of my family. I have to introduce the 3rd one. This is Bob Cat. He's named after my veterinarian, Bob Oles, but when I did not intend to take him home when he was brought to me. I was going to find him a home, but my vet said, look at that face. I said, you look at that face. Well, those blue eyes kind of got me, I must say.
It was the early 70s, and Alan and Betty went to work creating a television show in which Betty could realize both of her passions of show business and animals.
Alan and I sold a show called The Pet Set, where I would have a celebrity friend, and it was a half-hour show, and I'd bring him on or her and interview them with their pet. And then I'd excuse the pet, thank you very much, and keep the celebrity on for the whole half hour. And I wrote the shows, and I'd write the whole format around their interest in animals.
I can't tell you how tickled I am to have you here. Believe me, all 4 of you.
She would get into details about the characteristics of these animals, actually gave pet health tips on the care and feeding, and important information about the diseases and what was going on with trying to find cures for the diseases, and she really had a genuine interest in giving good information about the animals.
If I read something one place, I'd double check and cross-reference it. Well, every place the definitive answer always came from a place, Morris Animal Foundation.
The Morris Animal Foundation is dedicated to improving the lives of animals around the world. They have funded a variety of projects, from the construction of habitats for mountain gorillas in Africa to studies in better nutrition for cats and dogs. Betty has sat on the foundation's board of directors for over 30 years.
This year we're funding $2 million research into dogs, cats, horses, wildlife, and pain management. So I'm so proud of the organization.
While her work with the Morris Animal Foundation continued, the Pet Set was canceled after a 2-year run. But Betty soon found work on another series. The producers of the wildly popular Mary Tyler Moore Show called Betty and asked her if she'd be interested in playing a small guest role.
We were such good friends that when Jim Brooks and Alan Burns were looking for a character to fill the space that was left by Rhoda, they thought, well, maybe a happy homemaker kind of woman who's devious and unpredictable and self-serving, kind of like the way Betty White can be sometimes, sugary and yet spicy. And they said, that would really be great. Oh, well. And then they went on to look at a lot of other actresses. And I finally said to them, well, why don't you ask Betty White?
The show called one day, and I went in and did the what was to be a one-shot, and then they brought Sue Ann back, which was such fun.
And she came in and knocked their socks off. She was so good that they decided right then and there that she was going to be a regular character on the show.
I can't imagine anybody else coming into a group that had been together for 4 years at that point and had that thing really going like a machine, and to become another cog in the machine and do it brilliantly as she did.
She was a party crasher. She came into our party, and boy, did she fit in.
For 2 consecutive years, Betty won an Emmy Award for the role of Sue Ann Nivens.
She's so funny, but it's always based on truth. You know, it's based on her observations, which don't miss the mark by very much ever.
Sue Ann was kind of a surprise to the world who thought what a nice person Betty was. Well, Sue Ann proved the real Betty in there somewhere. Alan used to tell everybody when they'd ask him, you know, well, how close to Betty is this home economist? Yes, but this neighborhood nymphomaniac. And he'd say, well, they're the same person, except Betty can't cook.
One of the most majestic moments was when she had so castrated Murray that she had him being fitted for a wedding dress on the show, on that little show she had, homemaker show.
I mean, it's humiliating. Look, I told you I've got a lunch date.
Oh, you can go to lunch anytime. How often do you get a chance to wear a wedding gown?
A huge wedding cake in the background. And he finally, with a lot of our urging, realized what a fool, what a eunuch she was making out of him.
She didn't have a dummy big enough.
And she made one more request to him, and he said, no, 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 Sue Ann. And he picks her up and splotches her right down on this huge wedding cake.
Murray, don't use that tone on me. I mean, if you have something you wish to say to me, let's act like civilized people and simply sit down and discuss it.
All right. I'm sorry, Sue Ann. Forgive me. You were absolutely right. Let's sit down.
Could use a little more vanilla.
Alan would come to all the shows, and it was just the best of all worlds. And at that point, everybody was together. Mary and Grant were still together, and the show was doing beautifully, and it was one of the good times.
We would frequently have dinner with them after the show, which we shot on Friday nights, or just for no reason at all. They didn't live very far away.
But not long after her huge success on The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Betty's world came crashing down. Alan was diagnosed with cancer.
His cancer was in the stomach, and it was inoperable. The doctor operated, found out that there was nothing he could do.
Soon after Grant and I had separated, and I was on the phone with her. She was at the hospital with White Ludden, who was dying of cancer. And I said to her, Betty, what went wrong? Because we had both led these charmed lives up until then. Things were very positive. And suddenly, Alan was dying.
Betty was probably as devastated as she ever has been in her life.
Grant called me up one night and said, Mary, I don't think Alan has very much longer. Let's go visit him. Alan had been trying to get us back together. And so we did. We just went there and sat with him like everything was fine. And Alan was beaming. He was so happy to see us together, and he just knew that we were going to make it, that everything would be as it once had been. And of course it wasn't, but he didn't know that, and it pleased him.
On June 9th, 1981, 5 days shy of their 18th wedding anniversary, Betty lost the joy and love of her life. At the age of 64, Alan Ludden succumbed to cancer.
One of the most touching things that I recall, she had a dog that Alan Ludden had given her husband. And this dog then, of course, represented Alan. And he got old, and was finally got to the point where he died. And for Betty, it was closing two chapters. It was closing a chapter for the animal that she loved so dearly, but it was also closing that chapter with Alan.
Alan's legacy lives on today through the difference he and Betty made with the animals at the Los Angeles Zoo.
When we built the koala house, the koala Hilton here, this whole plaza had to be finished off too. And it was just at the time that my husband, Alan Ludden, died. And people knowing what devoted fans of the zoo and what a lover of the zoo he was, they raised all the funds and a couple of big donors, and they made it the Alan Ludden Plaza. And I'm very proud of that. Oh, he would get such a kick out of that.
Betty never found another love like Alan's, but she managed to continue to make others laugh through her gift of comedy. She was on the verge of her greatest professional success, and it would be golden. In 1985, and at the age of 63, Betty White struck gold.
There was at NBC, and we bought The Golden Girls, which was a very funny pilot, and became a very funny show. But what we didn't know was that it was going to be as popular as it was.
It was the best script. It was just a wonderful script. And we were so excited about how good it was and the fact that they sent it to us. And they sent it to me with the idea of Blanche being the character that I would play.
They had a part for me in mind, which was the part of Rose, the Scandinavian nitwit. And when I read the script, I said, oh dear, I should be playing Blanche.
The director decided to switch roles on Rue and Betty. Rue was to play Blanche, and Betty the role of Rose Nylund.
They switched parts, and at first I thought, I don't know who Rose is. Susan Harris, who wrote the script, said she's my favorite character because she is totally naive. She's not dumb, she's just totally naive. There's no sophistication about her at all.
Betty was that funny. I mean, you take this pathetic little creature that she played on the show, and she made that work for her beautifully.
I always said she had those orphan Annie eyes when she played Rose, you know, those hollow, blank eyes with nothing in them. I thought she was so funny in that part. And those wonderful, wonderful stories she told.
I'm from St. Olaf. St. Olaf is farm country. We're rough and rugged. We never see doctors. Never. In fact, my great-grandfather once removed his neighbor's appendix, and he wasn't even sick.
Why would he do that?
Let's just say they were playing poker and the stakes got a little high. For the first 5 years, we were never out of the top 10. And that's a lovely feeling. And you couldn't wait to go to work and see what they were going to have you doing this week.
She and I were highly aware, I mean acutely aware, of this wonderful, wonderful show we had and how it might not happen again and probably wouldn't. And every day was golden. Every week went by like that.
Blanche, how do you tell a slut from a yearbook?
Oh, how do you tell a slut from a yearbook? You don't have to buy a yearbook dinner.
Rose.
You can take a yearbook home to your parents.
Rose.
There's nothing wrong with having a yearbook on the coffee table.
Rose, this isn't a riddle.
Well, make it one. I had 3 good answers.
We became a family. And it's a cliche, but it's true. It's particularly true in show business, because you get the innermost part of somebody if you're with them 5 days a week and for hours on end and just interfacing with each other.
During the Golden Girls' first year, all 4 women were nominated for an Emmy Award, but only Betty went home with the statue.
I suppose that could be a kind of difficult moment to take when you've won something that's coveted by other people and you want it, but you want them to be happy too.
One thing that's always bothered me about Betty, it's that she won't ever admit that she's succeeded at anything. She's always, very apologetic that she even got that laugh. God forbid it should have gone to somebody else. She's just too modest and self-effacing for her own good. But she'll never change. We've all kidded her about that for years, and she just bats her eyes and changes the subject.
Eventually, each Golden Girl won an Emmy for her work. In 1992, the Golden Girls ended 7 highly successful years on television. And Betty is still cultivating fans through its reruns.
With the ongoing replays of the show, I think right now we're on 6 times a day all over the country. You can't walk through an airport. I mean, you check in your luggage and the skycap hugs you, which is lovely.
She's so good as an actress that you very quickly forget any personal reality that you have. You just get into the character, into the scene, and into the show and its premise. So I didn't spend a lot of time saying, oh, good for you, Betty. I just was laughing hysterically at yet another St. Olaf story or whatever it is she was doing.
She can sense her audience. She knows what will work. She knows when to stop. And she knows how to top. She's a master at all of those.
Teenagers or 20-year-olds or the little ones like this, say, oh, it's Woes. They can't say it yet, but they know who Woes is. It's a, gosh, what a blessing.
As Rose Nylund, Betty entertained millions of people. But even she couldn't predict the impact that role would have in saving the lives of thousands of animals. After the Golden Girls' successful run, the producers decided to spin off another show with Rue, Estelle, and Betty called The Golden Palace. Even though the show lasted for only 1 season, it made a huge difference in the battle against canine abuse.
We got more mail on the show we did about greyhounds and the tragic circumstances of when they stop winning races, their lives are miserable or shortened or ended.
Now, I know you'll do your best, but if by any chance you should lose, remember there's always next time.
And I'm afraid if she loses, there won't be a next time for this little girl.
What do you mean?
Well, you only get so many chances when you're a racing dog. If she doesn't come into the money today, I'll have to put her down.
Well, I don't think insulting her is going to help.
You know, Mrs. Nylund, by putting a dog down, I mean putting her to sleep.
What?
They would explain the situation to Rose, and Rose thought the greyhounds were great, but she didn't know the problem. So in explaining it to Rose, of course, they explained it to the whole audience.
When Betty did the show about the greyhounds, because everybody watched Betty and she had the attention of everybody, all of a sudden it became a very important part of American life. People went out looking for organizations that would adopt greyhounds that are retired from the racetrack.
I just don't understand how people can keep letting this go on. I mean, something outlives its usefulness and you destroy it? Well, Sophia can't work as hard as she used to. And it costs money to feed and clothe her. Maybe it'd just be easier if we put her to sleep.
Tell him, Rose. She is just trying to prove a point, isn't she?
I know Betty feels as I do about animals that they need a voice to speak for them. They need someone to champion their causes.
Although Betty has spent countless hours in front of the camera discussing animal issues, she has spent even more time off-screen working to make a difference.
I've been a board member, trustee of the Los Angeles Zoo for 28 years. And all that time we were trying to get our own zoo commission because we've always worked through Park and Recreation, which means you're behind the highways and the golf courses and all those things. Then the zoo is down here somewhere. We finally got our own zoo commission.
She was very obviously involved with the zoo. And this is why I asked her to become one of the leaders in taking care of animals in Los Angeles by becoming vice president of the Zoo Commission.
Very often you'll find that there are those people who talk the game and there are those people who do the game. She does both.
The reason I enjoyed my work at the zoo is you go backstage all the time. You've got a license to steal to go backstage. I always say that I find animals endlessly fascinating. And you don't have to love them as much as I do, but you must find them interesting in some aspect. And to try to interest, if you can open that interest door, then you've opened a door to somebody who's going to be conscious of animals from then on.
She's always been a person who was willing to get their hands dirty, even though she was this great celebrity. And at the zoo, she's there early in the morning, feeding the baby chimps.
Would you like another bite? We have made so many strides at this zoo, and the heartbreaking part used to be that people would say, oh, I'm going to take a trip to California. I'm going to go to Disneyland. I'm going to go to Universal. I'm going to go to the zoo at San Diego. And I wanted to cry. But our zoo has come to the point now where it's going to be very soon one of the top-ranked zoos of the world. That is, unless some people eat us out of house and home here.
The zoo community has changed more than any community of any kind, because they used to be and highly competitive with each other and one of everything. And if an animal died, you just went out in the wild and you got another one, you know, to replace it. Well, it has changed to the point of no return. Now they're really the ark. There are many species that, had they not been taken into captivity, would be extinct today.
She's a good lady. She's good people. And I guess it must be a burden to her, too, that so many people adore her like that. She's adored by her fans.
When I think of Betty White, I always see her with a big, open smile. She's very funny in person. She's very dry and funny. But she does it with a straight face. But who she really is that big, open smile.
Well, the secret of being happy in life is to give to others. And nobody is a bigger giver than Betty White, and nobody is happier than Betty White.
I think Betty White is really the perfect golden girl.
There you go. How's that? Is that good stuff? You got the best stuff you ever tasted?